The Holy Gospel this morning comes from St. Mark in the 12th chapter. Now, as Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say loud prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." So he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. Now a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth about a penny. Well, then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For of them they have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The gospel of our Lord. You may be seated. With apologies to those who are going to watch this sermon on the internet, I just need to know, where is that sign-up sheet? Oh, there it is. If it doesn't get to all the way to the back and start working its way down by now, we're going to flat out run out of time, and that means pen and cashier will have to come to each of your houses. So do not delay and make sure you put your name down on at least one line. Well, when I was a kid growing up, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have those kinds of fun things. And you had to find out things the old-fashioned way. You had to stay up and watch TV, or you had to read in a newspaper. And that's sort of how the world was. There were magazines and things like that. They were these publications that people would print and flip through. There were newsletters and all this kind of stuff. I know many of you still remember that, but I'm just practicing because the next sermon, absolutely no one will know what a newspaper or a magazine is. But that's how we learned, right? And there was a guy back in the 70s and 80s who was what nowadays we would find them. He would just be a regular old celebrity. We wouldn't pay too much attention. But back in the day, he was pretty famous for what he did. He was of all things, he was a magazine publisher. But he was sort of an iconoclast. His name was Malcolm Forbes. And he used to, in his offices that were in downtown Manhattan, he would ride his motorcycle to work. He'd wear a leather jacket and motorcycle boots. And he was kind of famous. He had long hair. In fact, I always hoped that my hair someday would look like Malcolm Forbes. But it's just not working. And so I was kind of impressed by him. I read a lot of his stuff and whatnot. Well, it turns out that Johnny Carson, he used to host the Tonight Show long before Jimmy Fallon was doing doo-wop songs with Billy Joel on it. And Johnny Carson was in his last week of his show, and he wanted to get on all these guests that he had never been able to get on over the course of his 25, 30 years of being the host of the show. And one of those people was Malcolm Forbes. So Malcolm Forbes comes onto the show, and Johnny Carson says, I love having you here. I've always wanted to have you on the show, but I just got one question I always wanted to ask you. And Malcolm there, multi-millionaire magazine publisher in his motorcycle jacket and his motorcycle boots. He says, "Okay, Johnny, give me a question." And he says, "Malcolm, how did you make your first $1 million?" And Malcolm said, "Johnny, I did it the old-fashioned way. My dad died." Now, in our country, we tend to think you can make your own million, but for most of the world, and indeed certainly for those in Jesus' time, money, like poverty, was something you inherited. Wealthy people were wealthy because their parents were wealthy, and because their grandparents were wealthy, and their great-grandparents were wealthy. And poor people were poor because their parents were poor, and their grandparents were poor, and their great-grandparents were poor all the way down the line. There was no mobility between classes. You couldn't work harder and make more money. That's just not how Jesus and the economic system of his time worked. You inherited your wealth. You inherited your poverty. Which also goes to say that for Jesus, there's no moral or ethical condemnation to being wealthy or rich. For Jesus, to say that one is better because one is rich or poor would almost be like saying it's better to have blonde hair than brunette hair, or to have blue eyes rather than green eyes. There's absolutely nothing you can do about your social economic class in Jesus' time. You can't work harder and make more money. It just doesn't work that way. The only way you can make money is to inherit it from your parents. There is no other option. So when Jesus is sitting there at the temple watching the wealthy people put in large sums of money, they were the only ones who could. because they were the only ones who had money. And so for better or for worse, the rule was to tithe 10% of your income. And so Jesus is watching the wealthy people follow the rules. They're coming in, putting in 10% of their income, and leaving. No big deal. That's what you do. If you have money, you tithe it. Now, we have to presume that for those who didn't have a lot of money, the tithe was a little difficult. So, just like today, if you're only making $9 an hour and you still have to pay the same amount for gas as someone who makes $1,000 an hour, you have to make sacrifices a little bit more when you're making a lot less. So the same was true even there. So there were many, many poor people in Jesus' time who probably never contributed to the treasury. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't have anything to give. You could just imagine the priest going to the treasury box and saying, oh, look, here's some shekels, and here's some gold, and here's some silver. Oh, and look, a feather. That's nice. Let's make a quill out of that or something, But if you don't have anything, you just grab the pigeon feather that you found on the street, stick it in the box, and call it good and hope God doesn't notice. That's how we do it when we don't have it. We, of course, live in a different society. We believe that you can actually work for your money and that you can work your way towards greater and greater wealth, and that poverty oftentimes is a sign of, something else besides just who your parents are. But in Jesus' time, it wasn't like that at all. So when he is watching these people put in this money, he's like, it's good. It's good to see. We're collecting. That's the way it's supposed to be. But then all of a sudden, something happens that changes the whole equation for Jesus. A widow, obviously poor, comes to the treasury box and puts in 2 small copper coins. And Jesus says, hey, guys, come over here. See that widow right there who just put in those 2 coins? They're like, yeah. He goes, that's what we're looking for. That's what God wants. Did you see it? It just happened in just that flash. Jesus challenges us to take our wealth and our poverty and understand that what God is about is not about how much money you have in your bank account or how much you can place in the offering basket. But what God is about is the generous spirit of heart that God graces us with to allow us to be able to give it all. Because what God is looking for with this spirit of generosity is not somebody who can, balance the books or somebody who can pay the bills, but instead with the spirit of generosity to understand that you have been graced beyond your wildest imagination to live and love in this world without fetter or without bondage. To be able to reach out and give and give and give because the grace of God never ends. If you are sharing and living in the grace of God, you have an unlimited and bountiful supply because God never runs dry. And it's precisely because we, in our own ways, want to hoard what little we have and collect and persevere to save enough for lunch that we somehow miss the fact that it's the generous spirit that God has implanted in each of us that impels us, encourages us to go out into the world and share the grace and love that we have received. Now, unfortunately, Mark doesn't write anything about what Jesus thought about the woman other than that she was fairly impressive. But what I wonder most often is, why does a woman who has nothing go and stand in line with all the people who have a lot and contribute her 2 coins to the treasury? What kind of person is that? What kind of person would stand in line with all these wealthy people waiting her turn to know full well that she's not going to give anything like the person in front of her, the person behind? That all she has are these 2 small copper coins. And I wonder, as she's standing in line, did she do the thing of like, well, should I give just 1 coin and keep the other one for an emergency? Or did she do one of these things? Well, like, what am I going to do with 2 copper coins? I can't do anything with 1 that I can do with 2. I might as well give God both and see if God can make something out of it. I mean, what was she thinking? What was going through her mind that somehow she thought that this would be some way to spend her time? Why wasn't she out there at the edge of the field gleaning the droppings from the harvest? Why wasn't she, sitting on the side of the road begging like the rest of the widows? Why was she standing in line at the treasury to give 2 copper coins that in all probability meant absolutely nothing to the scribes and Pharisees who counted them? What does she get out of giving so little? But with a generous spirit and the heart and the spirit of generosity in God, it doesn't matter how much you give. It doesn't matter whether you give a lot or you give a little. To give it all is to be able to understand that God has graced you to give anything. And to live with that kind of love and hope is precisely what Jesus says is so impressive about this woman. It's not that she has nothing. That's not impressive. And it's not any more impressive than those who have a lot. What's impressive is that this woman actually enjoys life, that this woman actually cares about what God has done for her, that this woman somehow finds it valuable for her to be able to give to God something back, even if it isn't very much at all. The gift of generosity is a spiritual gift. In both Galatians and Ephesians, Paul mentions this as something that the Spirit graces us with. And I'm thankful to know that, because the Spirit seemed to have missed me in this particular regard. I have administration skills, but the generosity one I had to learn. I had to be taught by a mother and a grandmother and a wife about what it means to be generous of spirit. I didn't know that. I thought it was all about gathering as much as I could and showing to everybody else that I was better, faster, stronger, and wealthier. I thought it was all about me climbing up the ladder to get to a high point. I thought it was all about me attaining degrees and credentials to be able to sit back and say, this is who I am. But through the love and patience of people like my grandma or my mom or my wife, I saw that the world was way more about what I could conquer and attain. The world was about love and hope and trust. The world was about reaching out and connecting with people on a one-to-one basis, to be able to look them in the eye and to be able to say to them, you matter. The world was about opening up your arms and allowing people to run into it, even people who may not deserve it or need it, but people who just need to know that they connect. And that was a far cry from growing up in the schools I went to, where it was all supposed that the white males like me were going to rule the world next. To have the spirit of generosity that the widow showed that day in line at the treasury is to run counterculture to everything that we stand for in this country. And as we approach Veterans Day, that is a tough lesson to realize, that sometimes you have to live in loss. You have to live in humility. You have to live in grace. And it is a tough, tough lesson to learn. We constantly want to win. We constantly want to save some back for an emergency. We constantly want to save some back for a rainy day. And we would rather live in that kind of constant fear than trust in the gracious activity of a God who will never let us down. I don't know what that widow was doing that day. But if she's like all the other people that I know who have that spirit of generosity, when she put those 2 copper coins in, I imagine that she dropped them into the box and she said, I only wish it could be more. Because people who have the spirit of generosity that I'm talking about, they give as much as they possibly can, but you know what? They always wish it could be more. And whether they give thousands or hundreds or pennies, they put it into the offering boxes and places in the world where grace is happening, and they say, I wish it could be more. To me, the measure of a generous heart is somebody who gives as much as they can but still despairs that they just can't give it all. Today, when the offering plate comes around, you put in what you put in. I understand that. And there's no judgment here about how little or how much the number is. But I do hope that every time you put something in any offering plate, your heart says, I wish it could be more. Because that, my friends, is what made the widow so impressive to Jesus. Not that she gave, but that she wished it could be more. Amen.